Hi everyone. As you've noticed, I am not in the classroom anymore. The reason is we got notification yesterday that we should move all of our classes online to avoid having large gatherings. With that in mind, I would like to record a follow-up to what I gave to my class on Monday. So students, listen in. There is no extra credit, but maybe you're curious about what I think about these things. And everyone else, I'd like to let you know what it looks like as a scientist with an internet connection. Who do I trust, and what kind of open science data can I look at to try to figure out what is going on with this coronavirus outbreak? Now that we are not doing large gatherings together as a city anymore, classes can be moved online, and so this is part of that. So I'd like to follow up at first on what's going on with the next, I'm always forgetting the name of this one, nextstrain.org, which is the open science gathering of all of the genomes that we had. Last time I talked about how there were 2 genomes from Washington. Now there are a lot more. The 2 genomes that we had before were related, granddaddy, grandchild. And those are actually shown at the bottom of the screen still. But you can see when I talked about this last time, this is what it looked like. Those red dots at the bottom of the screen are the Washington cases. Washington cases are in dark red. Now, this is the new data, and if my head's not obscuring it, you can go and look at the data yourself if you want to at nextstrain.org. The red dots have expanded. We have a lot new cases that we've tested for, and some of those cases we've gotten the genome for. Most of those genomes have clustered around the second genome that I talked about last time, which was taken from a Snohomish County student at the end of February. And so you see that there's a lot more red dots, perhaps behind my head, somewhere around here, where you can see that those are the cases and they're all closely related. Their letters read almost exactly the same as the 30,000 letters that we got in the genome from the second genome that we sequenced last time. So it looks like the community transmission in this case is ongoing. It also looks like there hasn't been that much time between when the genomes were gathered. There's no evidence of further divergence. But the other thing I'd like to point out, there's a couple of red dots that are actually from another country, the British Columbia, but there's one red dot above my head that is actually from Washington. It's the 3rd genome that's been sequenced. And that is the one about in the middle of the screen above my head. If you see, it's in the middle of all those yellow dots and light green dots. The important thing about this one is this is definitely a different genome. This is a different kind of sequence, and it's got a different family tree. The letters for this one are very similar to the letters in the genomes from European strains. In particular, it looks like this strain may have originated or spread from Rome. And if you've heard about the Italian outbreak that's going on, that makes a lot of sense epidemiologically. So it looks like we have 2 different strains of coronavirus. And the word strain is wrong. 2 different families of coronavirus. They are not very different. Remember that these are only different by a couple of letters. A couple of letters out of 30,000. So it's not like this is mutating into some new form. These are unlikely to cause a difference in function, but they do help us trace its family tree and help us see what it's related to. So now we've got sort of the Snohomish strain that originally came from Asia, and then there was another one that also came from Asia, but it came to us via Italy. It looks like one of them went west and the other one went east, and they met in Seattle. Now, there's a lot that we don't know. I want to show you one other way to look at these. The last way that I've been showing to you so far from nextstrain.org has the time that the sample was collected and sequenced along the x-axis, along the horizontal direction. There's another way to look at it that I think is also very interesting because it goes very well with the number of letters that have changed. You can basically do it by the number of letters that have changed. So if you change it to divergence, divergence is a measure of, out of those 30,000 letters, how many of them have changed and which changes are identical. And so you can look at it as divergence, and you can see down here, we talked about how there were 3 letters different between the first strain sequenced and the second strain sequenced. And on this, if you look at down at the bottom, sort of this way from my head, You can see the one red dot on the left, that's the first genome that was sequenced. The second dot, all the other dots are about 3 letters more to the right. That means that they are 3 letters different, again, out of those 30,000. They are the same letters if they are connected by a branch, and that means that they are likely to be related. We're all drawing inferences on uncertainties and things like that, but I would say this is about 95, 99% likely that all of these ones that we've sequenced that are connected with branches are indeed part of the same outbreak, part of the same infectious chain. And again, if you look into the yellow branch in the middle, you see that one red dot in the middle of all the yellow. The yellow, it means that European samples were taken, and the red dot means that that sample looks a lot like those European samples. So that's why I'm saying it looks like we have at least 2 paths that the virus took to get to us. But now it's spreading from human to human. So that's the conclusion that I'd like to start with. Most of these new ones are related to the second genome, so it looks like that test was very reliable. No sequencing errors or things like that that are significant. And then we have 2 genomes, one traveled east, one traveled west. That means that there are 2 infected populations, and it's a total guess as to whether the European one has a couple hundred people infected or maybe just a couple dozen. But it's definitely more, and it's almost certainly spreading from person to person. So that would get my impression of how many people have the virus up from a couple hundred to probably about 1,000 at least. That means, again, we have this pool of virus that is spreading in the community. The other question that I want to ask about what kind of data can I get from reliable sources, how bad is the infection? Well, it doesn't get much more reliable than the New England Journal of Medicine. And they have published the first case of the coronavirus in the U.S., what happened when the patient went into the hospital, and it turns out that this was the hospital in Snohomish County that was the granddaddy first sequence that we got. And I've got to say, this is kind of, if I always want to talk about bad news, good news, this is definitely the bad news coming first, because this strain is nasty. Like I said, it looks like it's decidedly worse than seasonal influenza. Here's the symptoms of the patient as the patient came in. The patient traveled from China and immediately developed a cough upon returning. So that's the first symptom that we have. And if you look at these different symptoms, you have fever that started soon after the cough. The patient went home on day 3, but worked through day 1 and 2. And therefore, it was out in the community, and that's got to be how it got transmitted from human to human. These viral infections take time to develop, and there's always going to be an infectious phase. So this is very normal for coronavirus. After a 3rd day at home, the 4th day the patient went to urgent care and then went to the hospital. The patient developed fatigue, nausea, vomiting at first, and then you also have other symptoms of diarrhea and abdominal discomfort as well. But mostly you see that it's the fever and the cough and fatigue that are persistent throughout the whole course of this disease. Again, this is like a severe flu, and everyone who's gotten one of those knows that that is bad, and this is like a bad case of the flu. In duration, it also seems to be severe. The patient was hospitalized for 11 days. After this, the patient did recover. You see the fever went down on about day 8. But you see that this is a long flu, this is an intense flu, and it requires intensive hospitalization. The other detail that stands out to me from this is the age of the patient. You may have heard that this flu hits people who are older particularly hard. I repeated that, and that is still true statistically. This is a person who is younger, and yet it still hit him hard. So I think it's important to see that this is a hard flu, it's a severe flu. The patient did recover, but it took weeks rather than days to recover. And that's a strain on the hospital system, and we've got to be ready for that if we're going to have health care provided to these people. The other thing, and this looked like bad news at first, but now I think that there might be a silver lining to this bad news. There was the nursing home outbreak, and that must be related to the many Washington genomes that we sequenced that clustered around the second Washington genome that I mentioned last time. So it spread and it led to many fatalities, and I'm sure you've heard about that because the fatality numbers are scary and they get reported over and over again. The other thing that's been reported is that firefighters, of course, responded when one of the patients was sick when they brought them to the hospital. And one of the other disturbing things is that the firefighters were quarantined after that, and we still have some of them in quarantine. We're watching for symptoms. Several of them did develop flu-like symptoms. I don't know for sure if they have tested positive for COVID-19 yet, but it's definitely something worrisome, something to keep your eye on. So how in the world could professionals who knew that they were going into an infectious disease have caught that disease if it's so contagious? Why weren't they better prepared? I was worried that somehow this disease found its way around the standard protections that we take. But now I'm beginning to see, from a story that just came out yesterday, the culprit may not have been lack of protective equipment, but it may have been lack of communication. It's possible that in at least some cases, the protective equipment was not used because the firefighters weren't told that this could be that COVID-19 flu that we were worried about. If you read this story, there's a lot of lack of communication, people that should have been quarantined, that they're looking at them, they're saying, why aren't you quarantined? And they say, I don't know I was supposed to be quarantined. Communicating the fact that you're supposed to be isolating yourself. That took a long time in this case, and that's a big mistake, and that resulted in a lot of tragic deaths and the virus basically running through the population that we had that was very vulnerable. And so the firefighters themselves probably caught it not because the virus is some kind of super virus that gets through gloves or something, but it's more likely this virus is just definitely very contagious, but the communication is crucial as well. And that's one of the themes I want to point out. We're not just talking about biological, we're talking about social things as well. We're talking about communication, and we're talking about the way groups of people interact with each other. And we've got some work to do because not only is there a biological challenge ahead of us, there is a sociological challenge ahead of us as well. So if I'm a scientist looking for data online, who do I trust? Who's got the data, and how and why is it collected? There's tons of news stories out there, and every time there's a fatality, that gets put over again and again, and then the news story gets updated, and it's very hard to find out exactly what the original information was and how that changed over time, because that's the nature of the internet. We've got too much information in one sense. So I was looking for a site that would actually sort of objectively collate the data, not focusing just on fatalities, but also on cases identified and on the severity of cases. Although that data is not very reported, it actually is part of what we need to do to look at the data in aggregate. Basically, I want more than a couple of data points. I want as many data points as I can. It turns out that the person who made the website that is best at collecting and collating the data as objectively as we can was a 17-year-old student, again from Washington State. So good news, Washington State is producing internet sites that help to cut through the fog of misinformation. And I want to remind you, this is just basically collecting the information that's put out there. The information may have been tainted at the source. And so we have to use our discretion and use scientific judgment in what the information means still. And you always have to think, how and why was it collected? But at least we've got some kind of website that is trying to collect numbers rather than just stories, because we've got to deal with this on the level of numbers if we are to understand how it's affecting everyone, rather than just individuals. And so here's the site, ncov2019.live. I recommend going there, and you can check to see how much it's changed since this morning when I'm recording this. And I was looking at that, and it separates it by country. It has mainland China is on top because that's where the epidemic started. And you see you have the numbers there, confirmed, serious, recovered, and dead. So the numbers you can get there and you can calculate, and the Chinese numbers are definitely scary. It's 80,000 confirmed cases, 3,000 dead. And that comes out to be about a 3% fatality rate. That's pretty high. And that's much, much higher than the regular flu. The regular flu is about 0.1% fatality rate. Now, of course, you've got to remember all of these numbers have been collected by humans. They're being communicated by humans. And so you've got to remember it's not completely accurate. It's going to be plus or minus a little bit. The question is plus or minus how much. So we've got it separated out by country here. And the question is, which country has actually done the most systematic job of collecting the data? And when you look up and down there, you know that there are issues with countries that are decided not to test or to implement flawed tests. We don't really know. We don't have standardized testing in this case for the virus itself. So looking back and forth, I was trying to figure out which country is the best source of data. Well, we want to go to the top of the list because we want as much data as possible. And which country do we choose? How do we tell which country is putting out the best data? So for this, I turned to a historical background from a blog I read called Anxious Bench by an author, Philip Jenkins, that I recommend. He's a historian who talks about all these things. And he talked about the 1918 flu, which is on everyone's mind right now. Now, notice that everyone's calling it the 1918 flu. It's no longer the Spanish flu because we look at it and the Spanish flu was a bad name. It was a wrong name and it conveyed wrong information because when you hear it, you think it came from Spain. It was not named the Spanish flu because it came from Spain, or at least biologically. It was named the Spanish flu because in 1918, the best information, the best data was coming from Spain, the best communication. And the reason is that in 1918, most countries were at war. And so you had the U.S. collecting information on the flu, but of course they wouldn't release it because they didn't want the Germans to figure out something about the challenges that the U.S. was facing biologically. Germans likewise. The flu was spreading globally, but we had the communication, the sociological aspect of the communication of the disease, and literally I'm talking about verbal communication rather than, viral communication, right? So the reason why the Spanish information was best was because Spain was neutral. They had no interest in disinforming their enemy. They had no interest in hiding what was going on. They were the source of the best information because they were not at war, at least not in the same way that the U.S. and Germany and other large countries were. I thought that was really interesting, and it also explains why we call it the 1918 flu now, because it didn't come from Spain. Spain should be given a pat on the back. Spain should not be given the opprobrium of being the source of this. Not that it's even opprobrium anyways. So when we look at this, which country is the most like Spain right now? Which one is getting us the most information? And I regret to say it is not my own country. We've had problems with testing and we've had problems with communication. We've had problems with officials who don't want to admit that there are cases because they don't want to be blamed for the cases. So we can't look at our data yet. We just don't have good data. China, on the other hand, there's also been accusations it has the most data. And there's been a lot of data coming out from China, but also, which of the data can we trust? We get this 3% fatality rate. But have all the people been tested? Has the system been overwhelmed so that we don't really have the number of cases confirmed that we should? How many cases are flying by the radar? Flying under the radar, I should say. So I go down the list, and we have issues with all the countries. Italy has issues, Germany has issues, Iran has issues. Actually, I'm not sure about Germany, but Germany doesn't have enough cases. You might have noticed that I skipped over South Korea. That is the country that has implemented testing most widely, and they've definitely had their issues with testing and with communication, but it seems that they have the most widespread and open testing. If I have to go with it, I have to go with South Korea as to what I think the data is best, where the data is best right now. And if you look at that, yeah, you have 7,000 cases confirmed, second most in the world right now, but you only have 48 dead. If you calculate that out right now, at this moment, that rounds up to a 0.7% fatality rate. Compare that to the 0.1% fatality rate for the flu. Now, I'm willing to admit that this data may be incomplete and this fatality rate may go up. Let's say it goes up by 50%. That brings it all the way up to a 1% fatality rate, which again is 10 times worse in fatality than the flu. So we talked about the case in New England Journal of Medicine that talks about the symptoms being maybe definitely worse than the regular flu, maybe not 10 times as worse, but how do you quantify that? So let's just say 10 times as worse than the regular flu is how much worse COVID-19 is than the regular flu that we're used to. And that's bad. And that justifies things like me staying home and teaching my class through a camera rather than being face-to-face with my students. But it's also 3 times better than 3%. The data's still in flux, but I think we've collected enough data from South Korea that this is the best and most accurate picture to a single significant figure, order of magnitude guess that what we're talking about is 10 times worse than the regular flu, but it's not 30 times worse. It's not 100 times worse. And I'm confident enough to say that to one figure of significance, okay? That's how scientists always talk, right? Because we've been burned before. So what does this all mean? Biologically, this flu is about 10 times worse. And also note, the one thing we know about this, it seems to be easier on you the younger you are. That still has held up. And so that means for 60 people that are 60 and over, people with underlying conditions, this will tax your system. And it will be 10 times worse. Stay away, take it seriously. You don't want to challenge yourself with this. We're also not sure how communicative it is. That firefighter thing spooked me for a little while because it suggested that it's like super communicative beyond even what we physically estimate the limits of communication are for this virus. But that turns out to have a flaw in that worry. It might be better than that, but it still looks like it's very contagious. You have these cases where one person flies back from China, spends 2 days at work, and that somehow starts an outbreak that gets passed down to a Snohomish high school student 3 weeks later. That's the kind of thing that indicates that this is definitely on the high end of communicativity, but at least it's within the range. And so we have this virus growing. Over here I have a GIF of bacteria growing exponentially. And at first, when the virus is growing, you can handle it, but when it reaches a tipping point and it overwhelms your system, that's what exponential growth gets scary. So biologically, there's a tipping point of viral infection within each person. There's a tipping point of viral communication between people in a society. And that's why I'm from home right now. That's why I back the decision to do classes online. And honestly, I've gotten to the point where I can do my classes online. We actually just finished up our labs last week. My students were really good about finishing them up. And so now we just have to figure out how to do final exams online, and we'll figure it out. We can communicate through the internet this way. So the good points of the internet is that we can do this sort of semi-quarantine. We can calm down Seattle so that we have fewer chances to pass the disease from person to person. So there are biological tipping points. But there are also other tipping points that we have to worry about other than the growth of the virus itself. There is sort of an immunological tipping point. When you are infected with a bacterium or a virus, your immune system has cells that multiply to be able to combat that virus. It's kind of like building up your own army to take on the invading army that's invaded you. And so your white blood cells are multiplying, your immune cells are multiplying in general, and the thing is they can reach a tipping point where they multiply too much. And they can reach a tipping point where they are damaging the bacteria or virus so much that they start damaging your own cells. This is particularly a problem in viral infections because viruses are hiding out inside our cells. So you've given the immune system a very difficult job. You have to be able to attack the virus and attack the cells holding the virus, but you want to stay away from normal cells. The immune system expands to take on this challenge, and sometimes the immune system expands too much, starts attacking itself. And that's a point, in some cases, it's a cytokine storm, because the messages that the immune system sends to be able to sort of say, oh, go here, attack this cell, part of that communication network are molecules called cytokines. When you have too many of those, the immune system itself reaches a tipping point where it starts basically attacking itself. It's friendly fire kind of case. And when you have that case, it actually looks like that's going on with the COVID-19, and might be one of the factors why it happens in the older populations more, because they are more prone to have the cytokine storm where they don't know how to turn their immune system off. What that means is there can be too much of a good thing in the case of the immune system and immune cells. So what is the sociological equivalent to the cytokine storm that we want to avoid, the having too much of a reaction, an overreaction to this flu? So the question I want to ask is, we are responding sociologically. We're closing schools. We're going online. Sociologically, is our response about 10 times more intentional for this 10 times worse biological flu? Or is it 10,000 times worse? When we get to the point where we're having a response that's 10,000 times worse to this than the regular flu, that's when I start to worry that we're at a sociological tipping point where we start doing friendly fire on ourselves, not with cytokines, but with words and with fear. So I want to say that we should be aware of this sociological tipping point. Community spread can reach a biological tipping point. We're trying to avoid that. As we avoid that tipping point, we also need to avoid the tipping point of sociological social media fear. Notice how sociological and social media have the word social in them. These can go exponential, and these can cause bad effects as well, especially if we start blaming others, scapegoating others, if we start saying that this is the cause of why, this is the exact cause, and this person is the exact cause of why this is happening to me. It's not the person, it's the virus, and that's what we are trying to avoid. And I have an example of this. As you can tell, I've been looking at the internet a lot, trying to figure out what a reliable source is. When I went to ncov2019.live this morning, I saw this message: U.S. state breakdown is coming tonight. My first reaction was to interpret this politically and to think of it as an alarmist message. And I'm like, oh my goodness, why is this site peddling this alarmism? The U.S. states are not going to break down tonight. This is 10 times worse than the regular flu. We're not going to have a breakdown of the political system tonight. I am going to stake my reputation on that particular fact. Well, you might be a more level head than I, because you might already have interpreted this correctly. This does not mean that it was predicting a breakdown in the political order. It meant that it was going to break down the data state by state tonight. And so tonight I'm going to be looking at the site again, because I'll be very interested in what the data has to say. But again, we're still in the realm where we haven't tested enough people. And so don't do the mortality rate calculation without realizing that the denominator, the confirmed case number, is too low right now, because we don't know how many confirmed cases there actually are. We haven't confirmed all the cases that we know must be out there. So yeah, I was caught by this own thing. I was caught by the multiplying the fear, and I had sort of reached the tipping point internally, and I had to pull myself back and calm myself down a little bit. So I want to go ahead and make some predictions. If I'm looking at data, I should be able to predict something from it. So take this all with a grain of salt. My predictions are 1% mortality rate is where I think it's going to stabilize once we have all the information. And my predictions are, it might take 40 days. I'm not sure where we are in that 40 days, to tell you the truth, but I think it's going to take 40 days for a community to be sure that it is free of at least this wave of coronavirus. So I base this on my 10 times worse estimation. 10 times 0.1% is 1%. But I also arrived at that conclusion by looking at the South Korea data. I don't know how communicative it is. We need better data on just how communicated it can be. And based on that data, we should try to look at that, and we should try to protect especially the most vulnerable, which means the older people. According to the data, if you're 50 or older, start to think about how you can take extra precautions. And if you have underlying conditions, of course, you don't want to have, if you don't want to get the regular flu, then you shouldn't be worried, you should also be worried about getting the 10 times flu. But a healthy young individual, looks like most of them can handle this all pretty well, although remember, the 35-year-old had to be hospitalized for 10 days to get over it. Take this seriously. If you are in the population, my advice is not to worry so much for yourself, but worry about others. Your job is to protect the others. And that may mean giving up some of your time, some of your work hours, some of your freedom. And this is going to be a big issue for our community as a whole. We have a lot of people that are paid hourly, that are working at restaurants that aren't having enough people right now. And we need to look at how we are going to support each other in the days to come. So wash your hands from the virus, which is biological, but also wash your hands in the sort of metaphorical or even spiritual sense, or sociological sense at the very least. Wash your mind from fear. If you know the fear is the mind killer speech, maybe that would be a good thing to think to yourself as you're washing your hands for 20 seconds, because it would help you avoid from reaching the sociological tipping point. Historically, I look back at the 1918 flu, and it looks like every wave of those, and there were multiple waves, every wave tended to last in a community for about a month or 40 days. And, as a Christian right now, I'm in the season of Lent. And just as we entered that season in Seattle, we got hit with the news about this. So I'm wondering how long we'll have to take these measures. I'm hoping the virus will not be that communicated and we can get back to some sort of normal life within a couple of weeks, but it might take 40 days. And 40 days is not a new time to be waiting through the flu. In fact, quarantine comes from the Italian for 40. And the reason is when ships came in to Italy in the plague days, they learned that you had to wait for 40 days to be sure that the ship was free of disease before allowing that ship to enter, the people from that to enter the community. Quarantine tends to be 40 days. Now with Seattle, does that 40 days start with the first genome in the middle of January? I'm hoping it does, but I'm not sure when it starts. Or is it starting right now? Are we just in the first week of it? We'll have to wait and see how much this goes. Keep testing, keep posting the data, keep reading, and keep in mind that this data, just because it's a number, doesn't mean that that number is exactly set in stone or that that number is contextualized. Don't just look at fatalities, but also look at sites like reporting of testing and expect that number to go up. As we test more, we are going to find more cases. In my view, that will be good news, because the more we know and the more accurately we know it, the better we will be able to take this virus apart and maybe even develop some therapies against it. All right, so that's as it stands, March 7, 2020. I will see how it goes, and we'll see how this holds up, how this ages as we go through. All right, everyone, stay safe and keep healthy.